I'm Jono Buchanan. Now, often when we're producing, we find ourselves thinking, I need that kind of a sound next. I need to go and find a bass or a pad or something that's going to sort of push the production on. And obviously we get into habits and we start thinking about the same sorts of sounds, and it's easy to sort of fall into the trap of going looking for sounds, particularly for presets. When the truth of the matter is, when we work with technology, anything can be an instrument. And this video is going to be all about making a couple of pitched instruments out of not obviously pitched starting points. So what I've done is to open up Ultrabeat, and what we're going to do is we're going to find two separate percussion instruments, one of which is more obviously pitched and one of which is much less obviously pitched. And we're going to see whether or not we can turn those into musical instruments that we can play and sample and do things with. Okay, so this is an 808 kit. Classic 808. And what we're going to do is we're going to focus our attention first of all around the congas, which are an octave up. There's this one and the high one, which is above. This sound is the one that I'm interested in. I'm just going to turn up my monitor volume a little bit. Okay, now what I'm going to do is to record one hit of just this note. Classic. Now actually this is a useful little moment that's happened right here. Now because I've played this note ever so slightly before the beginning of bar one, it looks like there is no note within this region. It's vanished. But if I quantize it, then the note reappears. So if ever you're looking at a region recorded at the very beginning of your track and the note appears to be missing, probably it's just been recorded a few frames early. Okay, that's a separate point. Let's get on to turning this into an instrument. So to do that, what I'm going to do is to bounce this in place, which I can do by simply control clicking on this region and coming to bounce in place. And as ever, if you're not seeing that, you'll find it in bounce and join instead. And then what's going to happen is we have a chance to just call this the name of the instrument, and I'm just going to bounce that down as an audio file, which will happen very quickly. Now, having done that, I want to turn it into a sampled instrument. At the moment, this is the audio equivalent of exactly the same sound. Sounds exactly the same, and it's now just an audio file rather than a MIDI file. So what I want to do now is to sample it. I can do that really easily by simply just dragging this piece of audio and then dragging it down and then left into the track headers. And what I'm going to do is to bring it into the quick sampler and the original version of that. And for individual sounds like this, the quick sampler is incredibly great because it just literally grabs this sound and turns it into an instrument that we can play. And it will map it across the entire instrument. So straight away, I've got a pitched instrument. Now, the interesting thing about the way in which pitched instruments work like this is that I have no idea whether or not this note, I could play a G, but I don't really know whether or not that is a G because obviously I didn't tune the conga before I sampled it. So if I want to use this instrument alongside some other instruments, the next thing I need to do, I'm just going to close down Ultrabeat for a moment, is to set up any pitched instrument. I'm going to just choose something from RetroSynth just to make life easy. And then I'm going to tune it by ear. So the first thing I'm going to do is to play a G, and then I'm going to play my sample. Well, actually, amazingly, they are the same pitch. But if they weren't, and if I needed to tune this sound, then what I'd be in a position to do would be to go looking for it here. So if I decided, for instance, that what I wanted to do was to offset the tuning by a fifth or by an octave, then obviously what I could do would be to come to the root key, and now it's an octave out from where it was to start with. And now I've got this quite plucky little instrument. Okay, so that's an interesting place to start. But the other thing is it's worth remembering that unlike sort of deeply sampled instruments where we might end up with lots of individual samples assigned to different keys, this is one sample mapped across the entire keyboard range. So if it's kind of pluckiness is limiting me in some way, that I can only play this super plucked instrument and I want to do something more interesting with it, the one thing I could consider would be to set up a loop across the entire sample to turn this from being a very plucky instrument into something which is a little bit more sustained. Now I can see the kind of transient shape of the way that this sound unfolds. I've got a very obvious decay phase and then the sound fades to silence. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to make the sample much, much, much shorter. And then what I can do is to use the zoom control so that I'm focusing in just around an area of this sound rather than the whole thing. In fact, I'm even going to bring this sound in a little bit more. And every time I do that, because I'm now in this sort of stretched view, what I have a chance to do is to be able to see the individual pieces of the waveform of this sound much more clearly. Now, when it comes to kind of looping sounds, trial and error is your friend. But what I'm effectively looking for as much as possible is to see whether or not I can find an area in this sound where, in the decay phase, the sound is a little bit more consistent. Now, obviously, over the entire piece, it just fades away. But you can see that effectively the volume difference from a couple of these waveforms isn't quite so extreme. By the time I get kind of into this area, whilst the sound is still getting quieter, if we were to set up a loop around this kind of area, then maybe we're in a position where we can find something that feels kind of sort of musical and feels like it's working. So what I'm going to do is to come into classic mode here, which is effectively going to give me a chance to play this sound rather than in one-shot mode where it will play all the way through. I'm going to come into classic mode. So far it will sound the same, but the advantage of this is it allows me to set up a loop, and I can either do that in forwards mode only, in reverse mode only, so that effectively the loop will read from the back and reverse backwards, or in alternate mode, so that effectively it's reading forwards and backwards. And the moment I select any of the loop modes, I can see that I now get loop brackets, allowing me to select the area around which I want to loop. Now again, what I'm going to do is to just trial and error this a little bit by selecting a loop value here, and we'll just see what this sounds like. This is why sampling is so fun. I've completely changed the character of this sound. Now then, obviously I can change it again, and I can do this in real time by moving the loop points outward from this point in both directions. Okay, now obviously what I'm getting at the moment are these clicks, and the clicks are happening because we're biting into the waveforms at both ends. What I want to do is to create something which is a little bit smoother. So what I'm going to do is to introduce a crossfade, which I can do simply by dragging up here, and we can begin to see the crossfade length. You can see that the sample is going to fade in early and it's going to fade out late, and that should get rid of some of the kind of bubbliness and the clickiness of this sound. Now, obviously, if I want a really smooth loop, what I'm in a position to do is just to continue to make adjustments until I find something that feels right. And obviously, the crossfade length is also going to help me. I'm going to increase that a little bit more. Gone too far there. You know what I'm going to say. If you're not enjoying that, okay, so what we've got is this crossfade that's just going to give us this kind of slightly ghostly kind of quality. And again, obviously, if what I want to do is to smooth this out and just produce something a bit more like the first sound that we had, where we get a sound which is less crossfaded and a little bit more biting, and we effectively get a sort of different character to the sound, then obviously I can undo the looping, or I can make the crossfades much, much shorter. Now, effectively, our conga sound was pretty pitched in the first place. It's got this kind of sine wavy quality. Can we extract playable sounds out of instruments which are less obviously pitched? Well, absolutely we can. What I'm going to do now is to come back to my my vintage 08 kit in Ultrabeat again, and this time what I'm going to do is to record a different note. And the one that I want is a snare drum. Here it is. Now this snare drum has got a kind of also a sort of sine wavy kind of middle to it, but with this noise over the top, which is giving us the kind of snarey quality. So we've got sort of two things that are present in this sound. So let's see what happens when we apply the same logic to that. No pun intended. Okay, we're going to bounce this down. This one is going to be called snare. And again, having bounced it down as an audio file, I'm in a position to repeat my trick from before. Simply just drag it down to an as yet unassigned track and turn it into a quick sampler instrument very rapidly. And again, as before, what we've now got is a sound which is going to be playable. There's its original key on C3. And obviously we can do this playable sort of sound. But unlike the conga, it's not immediately, obviously, a sort of pitched instrument in the same way that that one was. So again, what I'm going to do is similar stuff to the way that I did before. I'm going to significantly decrease the sample length because we sample the whole bar and the sound's much shorter than that. And again, what we can then do is to zoom in and have a look at the waveform. Okay, well, if we go again a little bit further so we can sort of see the middle of this, the other thing that is clear about a sound like this is that the kind of potential for looping is a little bit more obvious. So in other words, I can see that by the time I get into this sort of area, actually there's a little moment here where the volume doesn't significantly decrease. Whilst it's going to be an incredibly short amount of audio, this is a relatively consistent level. So if I again come into classic mode for a moment, and if what I then do is to go looking for my opportunity to potentially loop it, to come back in here, sometimes you have to just toggle between these different pages in order to get up the loopable parameters. What I'm going to do again is to select, this time I'll just go for forward mode, and what I'm going to do is to see what happens when I park my sample somewhere like the kind of apex of this little ramp here through to a similar position maybe here. Let's just see what happens with this. I like that. I'm going to just put in a little bit of crossfading. And we get this really harsh sound. Now, I can't be lucky enough to get a C 2 times in a row. So let's tune this next. Here is a C, and here's my loop snare. Right, so that is, I'm saying, about a tone out. Bit pitchy. So there's a C. So if you're finding that your sample is not only out from a sort of chromatic point of view, but also potentially a few cents out, and in a way, how could it not be, bearing in mind we've just decided to turn it into a kind of loopable, playable instrument, then obviously we have a chance to tune not only in sort of tones, but also in cents. And you'll tend to find that exactly where things need tuning becomes much clearer when you're working contextually. So if I was to put this sound up against another pitched sound within a track, then it would be pretty obvious if it was out of tune and I could just make that adjustment. But I think from a kind of semitone point of view, it's more or less much nearer C than it was before. And again, of course, I can keep making changes, having a look at maybe trying to potentially change the loop position. So let's turn it into an alternate loop again, and maybe I'm going to extend out the loop length. Let's have a look. And again, I'm going to just experiment with a different crossfade length. And what I'm also going to do is to just start thinking a little bit about the way that I might want this sound to unfold from a volume perspective. So what I want to do is to find the envelope for the amplifier, which is over here. At the moment, I've got this very short release time, and I want that to stick around a bit longer and become a bit more pad-like. And you can see that what I've done is obviously to engage the filter so that we're losing some of the frequency content. And I can choose a different filter to make that a little bit more extreme. And now we've got this kind of pad sound that's got some drive in it. It's almost like sounds that are as short as this benefit from this kind of overtony quality, which almost makes them a bit like oscillators. They suddenly take on all of this additional harmonic material. And because it all lies there in potential weight for me, in terms of the fact that I can obviously open the filter up, or I could increase the envelope depth from the filter envelope. So we get a bit of bite on the start of the note. This controls how much of that I'm going to hear. And suddenly we've got a brand new sound. And that's even before I start thinking about assigning LFOs or in some way applying this sound to a broader range of effects processes, for instance. So anytime you're thinking, right, you know what, I need a new sound for this track and I'm about to reach for a sound I've used before, try and stop yourself and instead think, okay, well, I wonder whether or not I could actually breathe a new sound into this production completely from scratch. Can I go and find a noise which I can turn into a pitched instrument? And what you'll learn is a load about sound along the way. You'll learn that sounds that are more complicated, like this snare drum that's got a noise element, gives you an opportunity to kind of mine different qualities out of the sound, whereas the conga sound was obviously a much purer, sine wavier sound to start with. And we can begin to see that with loops, and particularly with finding little loop lengths that just suddenly give us this kind of buzzy quality, but also this sustained quality, we can actually turn any sound into an instrument.